What are the 10 Commandments? Why does God want to restrict my freedom? And why should we bother with them today? That's what we're talking about in this conversation as we unpack our message series, 10 Grace, Freedom and the Good Life. So Dustin, even people who may never have read the Bible or even stepped foot in church, they would have heard this term, but what are the 10 Commandments?
That's a really good question, Corinne. I think all of us have different ideas and mental pictures that come to mind when we hear the 10 Commandments, depending on our upbringing, our exposure or lack of exposure to the Bible, and also kind of like pop culture's versions of the 10 Commandments. I think some of us think that the 10 Commandments are like a 10-point test, and If I pass the test, then I get to go to heaven. Or it's like 10 criteria, and if we kind of pass the criteria, we can avoid God's punishment, or we can earn God's acceptance. Or some people might just see it as like ancient wisdom. Jordan Peterson has his 12 rules for life, and Moses was an early incarnation of a Jordan Peterson, and he had his 10 rules for life. So people bring all kinds of different ideas. For me, the most helpful explanation I've read of the 10 Commandments is by a historian. He's an Australian historian, John Dixon. And so I'm just going to read that because I think John Dixon says it so well. He says, the 10 Commandments are a collection of laws given by Moses to the newly constituted people of God, Israel. For centuries, the descendants of Abraham, the patriarch of the Jewish people, had been a slave nation in Egypt, where they were put to grueling work by despotic pharaohs. Moses emerged from among these Israelites to lead his people to freedom. He was the Martin Luther King of the second millennium BC Middle East. Let my people go, was his plea to the Egyptian overlords, who finally acquiesced after a series of disasters sent on Egypt by the Creator. After leading his people into liberty, Moses was called by God up Mount Sinai and given the law we find in the Old Testament books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The very first instructions were the 10 Commandments. So I find that really helpful, whether someone is a Bible student or unfamiliar with the Bible. I think that's pretty understandable. And in the parts of the Bible that follow the 10 Commandments, there's about 600 plus more laws that God gives to the nation of Israel. But the 10 Commandments are really like the founding principles, to talk in legal terms, the founding principles from which flow then the whole body of case law that is unpacked in the 600 plus laws that follow.
And we're talking, words, commandments, laws. A lot of us internally react when we hear words like that because we're worried about it curbing our freedom. Is this what the 10 Commandments are going to do?
Yeah, I think all of us have that fear, don't we? Because when we hear those words, laws, commands, restrictions, the emotional response within us is one of condemnation, guilt, restriction. We think of traffic laws. Freedom is if there's no traffic laws. What a life. Let's not go into my personal driving history. And so when we hear 10 commandments or 10 laws, we think, well, this is going to restrict my joy. Let's see if we can avoid or get around this.
Yeah.
Whereas the word law, or we translate the English word law, but the original Hebrew word was the word Torah, which really has the idea of being led by an expert guide, or the kind of instruction that parents would give to their kids in the hope that their children grow up to be mature, contributing, wholesome members of society. And that's what I'm hoping for my children. And so we've swallowed this idea, particularly in the West, that freedom is being able to just do whatever I want. That's freedom. And unless I can do whatever I want, I'm not free. This is like the mantra of Elsa from Frozen, right? So Sarah and I have got 4 young kids, so like Disney Plus and Netflix is on in our house more than I care to admit. You've got kids as well, Corinne, so...
I'm nodding, yeah.
You're nodding. And so, Elsa's mantra is no right, no wrong, no rules for me, I'm free.
Just let it go.
Just let it go, right? We could all sing it together. I'm amazed that as parents we let our kids listen to this stuff and then we're shocked when they disobey us. We just taught them no right, no wrong, no rules for me, I'm free. And it's a Disney character, but I think it actually captures how many people think that the only way to be free is for there to be no rules on my life, no restrictions at all. But if we, think for at least 3 seconds beyond Elsa's cliche line, then I think we all know that there are certain choices we can make that actually don't make us free.
Right.
If I have no restrictions on my consumption of food and alcohol, well, I'll probably end up obese and an alcoholic. And that's going to curb my lifestyle. If I have no restrictions on the content I view online, well, I could end up a porn addict.
Right.
And so this idea that freedom is doing whatever I want, it sounds persuasive, but in the long run, it doesn't work because we end up enslaved and addicted and becoming a lesser version of ourselves. And God knows this. And so God knows the restrictions required for human beings to flourish. You could think about it this way. Imagine a fish deciding, I'm going to be free of my restrictions. I'm going to go live on land for a little while.
It's not going to end well.
Yeah, how's that going to go for that fish? And so when we say, well, I want to be free of God's restrictions, it's like a fish saying, I want to be free of water, then I'll truly be free. God knows that fish need water to be free, and God knows that us human creatures need some environmental restrictions in order to be free. And so I see the Ten Commandments as God giving us environmental restrictions as our maker because he knows how we need to operate in order to live a truly free life and be the people that we were always intended to be.
And I think that leads well into my next question, which is, I mean, we're talking about these tablets, they were carved in stone 3,500 years ago. Mm-hmm. How does that relate to today? We're in a fast-paced, tech-driven, multicultural world. How do we apply them today?
Yeah. People like to think, well, it's behind the times, the Ten Commandments, and it's not relevant today. For me, there's three reasons why we should pay attention to the Ten Commandments. The first is to understand God. When we think about the Ten Commandments, it would be a mistake to think about the Ten Commandments like they're an ancient policy document, right? So the nation of Israel got the ethics committee together, they got the policymakers together. God bless the policymakers, all the Karens of the world. God bless you. But it's a mistake.
That's Karen, not Corinne, right?
Yeah. Yes, of course. It's a mistake to think that it was just like it was an ethics committee or it was like a popular vote and they came up with social conventions where the nation of Israel and 51% of the nation voted that these should be the 10 laws of the land. That's not how it worked. The 10 commandments are actually a window into the character of God. So the commandments are not random, they're not arbitrary. Every command actually is an extension of the character of God. So the first commandment, God says, you shall have no other gods before me. Really what God is doing is he is positioning himself and his character as the central piece of the 10 commandments. The 9 commandments that follow really are God giving the outworking of his character. Or you can think about it this way. The 9 commandments that follow, just like the sun is central to the solar system and the planets orbit around the sun. Right. Well, so too, the following 9 commandments orbit around the first.
So the first is first for a reason.
100%. And so you could, if we just go through a couple of the commands now, God says, I don't want you to have any other idols. I don't want you to have any other gods. He's like, hey, I'm kind of like your husband and it would be great if you didn't have other husbands.
Yeah, right.
Like, is that too much to ask? Like, it would be great if this was like an exclusive monogamous relationship is kind of how you could phrase it. And then God actually explains why. It's not because he's petty and insecure. God says it's because he is a jealous God. Now, when we think of jealousy, we think, yuck, like jealousy is not nice. But there's a healthy form of jealousy, right? So there is a healthy form of jealousy that a husband would feel over his wife's affection.
Right.
Like if some other dude comes knocking on the door saying, hey, Dustin, can I take your wife out for dinner? Like there's going to be a certain anger that rises up within me and you would call that anger jealousy. Well, where do we get that jealousy from? We're a chip off the old block. We get it from God. God feels that way toward us. Well, that's a window into the character of God because most of us think of God as being this emotionless, feelingless kind of power in the sky,
right,
who doesn't really feel. But one of the first things God is saying is, no, I feel. I have emotions. Like, I feel strongly about you. Like, how amazing is that?
Yeah.
That God feels strongly. So you can see how the commandment, it's not random. The commandment is a window into the character of God. When God says, I don't want you to bear false witness, he's not just saying lying is naughty. He's saying, I myself am true, and I am truth. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And so God's saying, I don't want you to bear false witness because that defies my character. God himself is truth. In our message, the second message in this series, we go through commandments 2 to 9 and show how every one of those commandments is a window into the character of God.
Right. And what was the second?
To understand ourselves. Man, I'm still on the first one. I love this stuff. So firstly, to understand God, but secondly, to understand ourselves. And I think this is because even though it was 3,500 years ago, so we think irrelevant, human beings haven't changed much. Like, we're pretty much like the ancient nomadic Jewish people, except we've got TikTok now. Like, that's kind of, we've got phones and stuff. But our heart desires are essentially the same.
Right.
And
we don't covet our neighbour's ox, as you so rightly put it, but there's plenty of other things.
We have plenty of other things we covet, right? We covet their car instead of their ox. So the heart desires and the yearnings of the human soul haven't changed that much in the last few thousand years. So if you look at the heart matters that these 10 commandments speak to, they're things that are still questions that we wrestle with today. Like, how do I build trust with the people in my world? How do I find contentment? Why does fidelity matter in a family and in a marriage? How do I find rest? How do I get rhythm to my week? Because so many people are busy and exhausted.
Yeah.
Maybe God has something to say to that.
I'm looking forward to that message.
Yeah.
As a mum.
As am I. And so the more we look into these, the more we find, hey, they're ancient, but they're as relevant today as they've ever been.
And what was the third?
I think thirdly, the 10 Commandments show us how to live. How to live a life that God would call good. Everyone's got a vision or a version of what they would call a good life. Every politician, every political party, every blogger, every podcaster, ironic, has got a vision of that. Well, God has a vision of what a good life looks like as well. And the 10 Commandments have this twofold structure. You've got the first 4 commandments, then you've got the following 6 commandments. 4 plus 6 equals 10, public school, maths, figured that out.
Maths B.
Yes, absolutely. So the first 4 commandments show us how to relate to God. Serve him only, don't make images or idols, don't misuse his name, honour the Sabbath day. That's about how we relate to God. The following 6 commandments, honour parents, don't murder, don't betray your spouse, don't steal, don't bear false witness, don't covet. These all relate to how we care for and relate to our neighbour. And so the twofold structure of a good life, according to God, is love and honour God, and then love and care for your neighbour.
Right.
Jesus reinforced this when Jesus was asked, what's the greatest commandment? Singular.
Yep.
Jesus replied plural. Jesus said, no, I can't boil it down to one, there's 2. Firstly, you got to love God with all your heart, soul, mind and strength. Secondly, you need to love your neighbour as yourself. Jesus didn't want to get pigeonholed into one or the other, because we tend to get pigeonholed into one or the other. And this is what Jesus and the 10 Commandments are addressing. You see, a good life is not just loving and honouring God, because we've probably all met some people who loved God, but they were religious legalists and they treated people like dirt.
Yeah.
Like they had no grace for imperfect people. But they loved God. They took the Bible really seriously and they never missed a church service. But no one wanted to hang out with those people. And God is saying, I don't want the world to be full of religious legalists where people love me, but they treat my children, they treat people like dirt. That's not the world I want. But then on the flip side, if we only focus on commandments, the final 6 commandments, we have a world where we all really sincerely want to love people, but we struggle to arrive at the definitions of what love is.
Right.
Which is why we're reduced to slogans and cliches like love is love. You might as well say blue is blue. Bread is bread. Love is love. What does that even mean?
Yeah.
It actually betrays our inability to define it.
And I like how you articulated in the part 1, we're saved by the blood of Jesus, but now it's kind of like, well, how do we live?
Yeah.
And essentially that's the 10 Commandments guiding.
100%. Here's how you can live in a way that pleases God and and is in alignment with the character of God and the reality of the universe as God created it. And not only that, here's how you can live in a way where your own soul, your family, the people closest to you, and ultimately our communities can be the kind of communities where people would love to live. Who doesn't want to live in the community where there's no murder, no theft, people tell the truth, families are strong? Like,
yeah, sign me up.
Sign me up. How do I immigrate to that country? And so, again, even that shows how relevant the Ten Commandments are to us today. They help us to understand God. They help us to understand the deepest longings of our own heart. And I think they help us to understand how to live a life that is good and ultimately produces good outcomes and a good environment for our lives to flourish.
Thanks so much for unpacking that for us, Dustin. There's some really practical tips there, and we'll continue to unpack the Ten Commandments. And if you want to hear more, you can head over to our YouTube and podcast where we've got part 1 and part 2.